1943. Over the Mediterranean. A veteran Luftwaffe ace watches his wingman's fighter disintegrate at 1,000 yards, but his gun camera shows no enemy plane in firing range, only empty sky. The Americans had weaponized a design the Germans mocked as 2 planes, 1 pilot, mounting all their guns in the nose where every bullet flew like a sniper shot instead of a shotgun spread. But how did this one controversial design decision break the back of the world's most feared air force? And what did it reveal about why Germany was already doomed before the first shot was fired? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1943, the war in Europe had been raging for nearly 4 years. The German Luftwaffe controlled the skies over most of the continent like an iron fist. Their pilots were the best-trained fighting men in the air, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and the brutal Eastern Front. These men had flown hundreds of missions. They knew every trick, every maneuver, every way to kill an enemy before he could kill you. The Messerschmitt fighters they flew were fast and deadly, armed with machine guns and cannons mounted in the wings. When a German pilot squeezed his trigger, bullets sprayed out from both sides of his aircraft, converging at a point maybe 200 to 400 yards ahead. Get that close, and your enemy is finished. The German people believed their air force was invincible. Nazi propaganda filled the newspapers and radio broadcasts with stories of Aryan superiority, of German engineering genius, of the natural warrior spirit that flowed through their pilots' veins. Civilians were told that their sons in the Luftwaffe were gods of the sky, unstoppable and unmatched. The propaganda ministry released photographs of smiling aces standing beside their fighters, victory marks painted on the fuselage. 20 kills, 30 kills, some had 50 or more. These were the heroes of the Reich, proof that German willpower and German blood made them better than anyone else who dared challenge them. But there was something else the German high command believed, something that went deeper than propaganda. They believed in a certain way of doing things, a philosophy that had been drilled into them since before the war began. German aircraft were designed around tradition and doctrine. Guns belonged in the wings because that was where they had always been placed. Fighters were meant for close combat, circling and diving and getting right up next to your enemy before pulling the trigger. It was personal, it was honorable, it required skill and courage. The best pilot won, and German pilots were taught from their first day of training that they were the best. The economic situation in Germany by 1943 meant that every resource mattered. Fuel was precious, ammunition was counted carefully. Aircraft parts had to be salvaged and reused whenever possible. There was no room for waste, no tolerance for experimentation that might fail. The factories worked day and night, but they could not match the endless production that rumbled out of American plants across the ocean. Still, German commanders did not worry too much about this. They had quality, they told themselves. Let the Americans have quantity. One skilled German pilot was worth 10 American farm boys who had barely learned to fly. German intelligence officers studied reports about a strange new American fighter that had started appearing in small numbers. It had 2 engines, 2 tails, and a cockpit that sat in a pod between them. The Luftwaffe pilots who saw photographs laughed. The design looked awkward, unnatural, like someone had taken 2 airplanes and stuck them together. They called it Zwei Flugzeuge, ein Pilot, 2 planes, 1 pilot. Twice the target, they joked, twice as easy to shoot down. The engineers who designed it must have been drunk or insane. Any proper fighter had 1 engine, 1 fuselage, 1 tail. This American contraption looked like it would fall apart in a hard turn. The intelligence reports said the aircraft was called the P-38 Lightning. The name meant nothing to the German pilots. Lightning was fast, yes, but also brief and unreliable. They filed the information away and went back to their regular duties, escorting bombers and hunting Allied fighters over North Africa and the Mediterranean. The Desert War was brutal, with sandstorms that grounded aircraft for days and mechanics working in heat that could melt the skin off your hands. But the Luftwaffe held its own, shooting down British Spitfires and American P-40s with practiced efficiency. Then, the strange encounters began. It started with odd reports from pilots returning from missions over Tunisia and Sicily. A veteran ace named Klaus came back from a patrol with his wingman missing. He landed his Messerschmitt hard, climbed out, and told his commanding officer something impossible. His wingman had simply exploded in mid-air. One moment, the other fighter had been flying in formation beside him. The next moment, it was a fireball tumbling toward the desert below. Klaus had checked his mirrors, scanned the sky in every direction. There were no enemy fighters close enough to have fired. The nearest Allied plane he could see had been at least 1,000 yards away, maybe more. Too far for any gun to be effective. The commander frowned. Had there been anti-aircraft fire? No, Klaus insisted. They were too high, and there had been no flak bursts. Engine failure? Impossible. The other pilot had been on the radio seconds before, his voice calm and professional. Then silence and fire. The commander wrote it down as unexplained combat loss and told Klaus to get some rest. Combat did strange things to a man's perception. Perhaps he had been closer to an enemy than he realized. But the reports kept coming. Another pilot came back and said he had been hit from nowhere. Cannon shells had torn through his tail, forcing him to limp back to base with his aircraft barely controllable. He swore no enemy had been in the gun range. Another lost his engine to machine gun fire that seemed to come from empty sky. One experienced flight leader watched 3 of his 4 fighters get shot down in less than a minute, and he never saw the attacker close enough to return fire. Each time, his pilots had been trying to close the distance, following their training, getting into proper combat range where their wing-mounted guns would be most effective. At the evening briefings, the intelligence officers tried to make sense of it. Perhaps the Americans had developed a new long-range cannon. Perhaps they were using some kind of rocket weapon. The veterans argued among themselves. Some insisted the reports were exaggerated, that pilots were making excuses for their own failures. Others said something had changed, something they did not understand yet. But the doctrine remained the same. Close in, use your superior training, maneuver behind the enemy, and fire when you can see the rivets on his wings. One afternoon, a pilot named Franz was flying a sweep over the coast of Sicily when he spotted a P-38 at high altitude. Finally, a chance to face this strange American design and prove it was nothing special. Franz pushed his throttle forward and began to climb, ready to demonstrate proper German fighting technique. The P-38 did not run. It did not dive away. It simply turned toward him, almost casually, at a distance Franz judged to be at least 900 or 1,000 yards. Much too far to waste ammunition. Franz continued his approach, watching the twin-boomed filer grow slightly larger in his windscreen. He was perhaps 800 yards away now, still closing. Plenty of time. Then his aircraft shuddered. The instrument panel in front of him exploded in a spray of glass and metal. Something massive punched through his engine cowling. Black smoke began pouring back over his canopy. Franz jerked the stick, trying to evade, but his controls felt mushy and wrong. He looked up through the smoke and saw the P-38 still at the same distance, perhaps even a bit farther now, certainly not close enough for conventional combat. Franz nursed his dying fighter back toward friendly territory, his mind racing. He had been hit at 800 yards, maybe more. His cameras had been recording, as they always did. When he landed, barely, with his engine seizing and smoke filling the cockpit, the ground crew pulled the camera footage. They developed it and brought it to the intelligence officers. The film showed the P-38 at long range, showed the moment Franz's aircraft had been hit, showed no muzzle flashes that could be distinguished at that distance. The bullets or shells had simply arrived, invisible, devastating, impossible. The intelligence officers sat in their tent that night, studying the film frame by frame. One of them had a technical manual that had been captured from a downed American pilot. He flipped through it until he found the section on the P-38. He read aloud to the others. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20-millimeter cannon. All 5 weapons mounted in the nose of the aircraft, clustered together in front of the cockpit. No wing guns at all. Every bullet and every shell fired from the same point, traveling in an almost perfectly straight line toward the target. The room went quiet. One of the younger officers finally spoke up. "If all the guns fire from one place," he said slowly, "there is no convergence distance, no spread. The bullets do not scatter outward from 2 different wings. They fly together like a single beam. The effective range would be—" He did his calculations on paper, scratching numbers in the dim lamplight. "The effective range would be limited only by the ballistics of the weapons themselves and the skill of the pilot. Perhaps 1,000 yards. Perhaps more." Another officer shook his head. "Impossible," he said. "You cannot mount heavy weapons in the nose. The recoil would tear the aircraft apart, or at least make it impossible to aim. The Americans must have reinforced the entire front section, added weight, sacrificed speed and maneuverability. The P-38 must handle like a cargo plane. But the combat reports said otherwise. The P-38 pilots were not lumbering targets. They were patient, disciplined, firing from distances where German pilots could not effectively return fire, then either staying at range or closing only when they held every advantage." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The realization spread slowly through the Luftwaffe units in the Mediterranean. This American fighter with the strange design was not a joke. It was not an accident. It was a weapon built around a completely different philosophy. The twin booms were not a flaw. They were necessary to create a strong central pod where the pilot sat surrounded by his guns. The 2 engines provided redundancy and power. The high-altitude performance came from turbochargers that German fighters lacked. And those nose-mounted guns could reach out and kill at distances where traditional wing-mounted weapons were useless. France recovered from his wounds and returned to duty a month later. He was assigned to train newer pilots to pass on his experience. He told them about the P-38, about the danger of assuming the enemy would fight the way you expected. Some of the young pilots nodded seriously. Others still laughed and made jokes about 2 planes and 1 pilot. They believed in German superiority. They believed their training and their courage would be enough. France looked at their confident faces and remembered his own confidence before that afternoon over Sicily. He wondered how many of them would learn the same lesson he had learned, and how many would never get the chance to learn anything at all. The prisoner of war camp sat in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by farmland that stretched to the horizon. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann arrived there in the autumn of 1943, 1 month after Messerschmitt had been shot down over Italy by a P-38 that had seemed to appear from nowhere. He had ejected successfully but broke his leg on landing. American medics had set the bone with a clean white cast and given him pills for the pain. Now he limped through the gates of the camp with 60 other captured Luftwaffe pilots and crew, expecting the worst. Prisoners were meant to suffer. That was the natural order of war. The first shock came at dinner that evening. The guards led the prisoners into a mess hall that looked cleaner than most German military facilities Werner had seen. Long tables stood in neat rows. The floor had been mopped. There were windows with glass that was not broken. American soldiers in clean uniforms served food from behind a counter, spooning portions onto metal trays. Werner took his tray and stared at what they had given him. Roast chicken. Real potatoes, not the half-rotten ones he had eaten in North Africa. Vegetables that looked fresh. Bread that was soft and white. Butter. A cup of coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not the acorn substitute they had been drinking in the desert. He sat down at a table with 3 other pilots. None of them spoke. They ate slowly, carefully, waiting for someone to tell them it was a mistake, that this food was meant for someone else. But the American guards just stood by the walls, relaxed and bored. One of them was reading a comic book. Another was chewing gum, making little bubbles that popped softly. They did not look like men guarding dangerous enemies. They looked like men doing an easy job they found slightly dull. After dinner, Werner saw something that made him stop walking. Through the mess hall window, he watched a truck pull up outside. It was painted red and white with words on the side. Coca-Cola. He knew that name. Before the war, you could sometimes find it in Berlin, an American drink that cost too much. The truck driver got out, opened the back, and began unloading crates. Dozens of crates, hundreds of bottles. An American soldier signed a paper, and the truck drove away. Werner realized they would deliver more next week, and the week after, as much as anyone wanted. The United States could afford to ship sugar water across an ocean to give to prisoners. Over the following weeks, Werner began to understand the scale of what he was seeing. The camp held 2,000 prisoners. Every one of them ate 3 meals a day. The food was not luxurious, but it was adequate, sometimes more than adequate. On Sundays, they got ice cream. Real ice cream, made with real cream and real sugar, served in bowls by guards who seemed to think this was completely normal. Werner did his calculations in his head. The resources needed to feed 2,000 enemy prisoners this well. Multiply that by however many camps existed across America. Multiply that by the food going to American soldiers overseas, to the British, to the Russians. The numbers became impossible. Germany was rationing bread. America was giving ice cream to the men who had been trying to kill their sons. One afternoon, Werner and a dozen other pilots were assigned to a work detail at a nearby factory. They rode there in a bus with padded seats, guarded by 2 American soldiers who spent the trip talking about baseball. The factory made parts for aircraft engines. When they arrived, Werner expected to see something like the German factories he remembered. Dark buildings where workers labored in shifts around the clock, where every piece of metal was precious and nothing could be wasted. Instead, he saw a building with enormous windows that let in sunlight. The floor inside was concrete, clean enough that you could eat off it. Machines stood in perfect rows, each one tended by a worker in coveralls. The noise was incredible but organized, the sound of production happening at a scale Werner had never imagined. The foreman, an older man with gray hair and thick glasses, showed them what to do. Simple work, moving parts from one station to another, stacking finished pieces in crates. Werner worked next to a machine that stamped out valve housings. He watched it cycle. Stamp, release, one every 6 seconds. He counted. 10 per minute, 600 per hour. The factory ran 2 shifts. That was 1,200 valve housings from this one machine every day. He looked down the row and counted 30 identical machines. 36,000 parts per day from this one room in this one factory in this one town in Pennsylvania. And this factory only made parts. Somewhere else, those parts were assembled into engines. Somewhere else, those engines were mounted into aircraft, the aircraft that had shot him down. During the lunch break, the American workers sat in a cafeteria and ate sandwiches they had brought from home. Werner and the other prisoners were given sandwiches too, provided by the camp. The Americans did not seem hostile. One of them, a young man, maybe 20 years old, asked Werner where he was from. Berlin, Werner answered in his careful English. The American nodded and said his grandfather had come from Munich. They talked for a few minutes about Germany before the war, about beer and mountains and Christmas markets. The young man offered Werner half of a chocolate bar. Werner took it, feeling strange. This was the enemy. This was the nation he had been taught to see as weak and corrupted by mongrel races and Jewish influence. This young man, whose grandfather was German, who shared his candy with a prisoner, would go back to making parts for the planes that were bombing Werner's homeland into rubble. Back at the camp that evening, Werner lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. The barracks were heated. The toilet facilities had running water and soap. There was a small library where prisoners could borrow books. There was a room with a radio where they could listen to music, though not news broadcasts. The American Red Cross had provided paper and envelopes so prisoners could write letters home, though Werner knew those letters were read by censors. He thought about the last letters he had received from his wife before his capture. She wrote about standing in line for 4 hours to buy a loaf of bread. She wrote about the coal shortage, about wearing her coat inside the apartment because there was no fuel for heat. She wrote about their daughter asking why they never had eggs anymore. A younger pilot in the bunk below him spoke up in the darkness. Hans, 21 years old, shot down on his 9th mission. He said he had been thinking about the factory, about the machines, about the way the Americans worked. Everything was measured, he said. Everything was counted and recorded and made efficient. They had charts on the walls showing production numbers. They had meetings where they discussed how to make the process faster. It was not about working harder, it was about working smarter. Hans paused, then asked the question that was bothering him. If they can do this for engine parts, what else can they do? How many tanks are they making? How many ships? How many bombs? Werner did not answer. He was thinking about the Coca-Cola truck, about the ice cream on Sundays, about the chocolate bar from a factory worker whose grandfather was German. He was thinking about the propaganda he had believed, about Aryan superiority and American weakness. He was thinking about the P-38 that had shot him down, the one he had never seen coming, the one that had fired from a distance where German guns could not reach, the twin-boomed design that Luftwaffe intelligence had mocked, the nose-mounted guns that ignored every rule of traditional aircraft design. The Americans had not cared about tradition. They had cared about results. They had built a weapon that worked, even if it looked wrong to everyone else. Just like they had built factories that produced at scales that seemed impossible. Just like they fed their prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. The moment that broke Werner Hoffmann happened on Christmas Day, 1943. The prisoners had been told there would be a special meal, but none of them expected what they saw when they entered the mess hall that afternoon. The tables had been covered with white cloth. There were decorations on the walls, paper chains and stars that American children from a nearby school had made. Each table had a small pine branch in the center, decorated with bits of colored paper. The smell hit Werner first. Roast turkey, ham, fresh bread, potatoes cooked with butter and herbs. The kind of meal his family would have eaten before the war, when Germany was still whole, when the future still seemed bright. The American camp commander stood at the front of the hall and spoke in slow, clear English that Werner could mostly understand. He said that even in wartime, some things remained sacred. He said that Christmas was about hope and humanity. He said that the prisoners were far from home, and while they were enemies of America, they were still men who deserved basic dignity. Then he wished them all a Merry Christmas and told them to eat. The guards served the food themselves, spooning generous portions onto each tray. Werner saw one young guard, barely 18 years old, smiling as he added an extra slice of turkey to an older prisoner's plate. The guard said something in English, and another prisoner translated. He had said his mother always made too much food at Christmas, and it was bad luck not to share. Werner ate slowly, each bite tasting like a memory. This was the food of his childhood, of peacetime, of a world that no longer existed. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence or spoke in quiet voices. Some had tears in their eyes. One man, a veteran bomber pilot named Josef, set down his fork and put his head in his hands. Werner knew what Josef was thinking because he was thinking the same thing. Their families back home would not eat like this today. There would be no turkey in Berlin, no ham in Munich, maybe some thin soup, maybe some bread if they were lucky. The children would go to bed hungry, dreaming of food that did not exist anymore. And here, in a prison camp on the other side of the world, their enemies fed them a feast. After the meal, the prisoners were allowed to attend a church service in the camp chapel. Werner was not particularly religious, but he went anyway, needing something to hold on to. The chaplain was an American lieutenant, a young man with kind eyes who spoke about peace and forgiveness. He read from the Bible in English, then again in German for the prisoners. His German was awkward but sincere. He told the story of the birth of Christ, of a child born in poverty who would teach the world about love. Werner sat in the wooden pew and felt something inside him cracking. All his life he had been taught that strength mattered most. Power, will, the ability to dominate and control. The Nazi Party had promised to make Germany strong again after the humiliation of the First World War. They had said the German people were destined to rule, that other races were inferior, that might be right. But here was America, the nation they had called weak and decadent, feeding its enemies. Here was America, which could have starved them or worked them to death or simply shot them, instead giving them heated barracks and medical care and Christmas dinner. This was not a weakness. This was a different kind of strength, one that Werner had never been taught to recognize. It was the strength of a nation so wealthy, so productive, so confident in itself that it could afford to be generous. Germany hoarded every scrap and still ran out. America gave freely and had more to give. That night, Werner began writing in a small notebook that the Red Cross had provided. He had been keeping brief notes since his capture, but now he wrote with purpose, trying to understand what he was experiencing. He wrote about the P-38, about how the Luftwaffe had mocked its design because it looked wrong, because it violated the traditions of aircraft engineering. He wrote about the German insistence that fighters needed wing-mounted guns, that close combat was the honorable way to fight, that superior warrior spirit would triumph over mere technology. The Americans ignored all of that. They had asked a simple question: what is the most effective way to destroy an enemy aircraft? The answer was to fire all your weapons from a single point, so every bullet went exactly where you aimed. The fact that this required a strange twin-boom design did not matter. The fact that it looked awkward did not matter. Results mattered. Effectiveness mattered. Everything else was just pride. Werner wrote, "We built our aircraft to match our ideology. They built their aircraft to win. We thought this made us strong, and then weak. We were wrong about everything." He thought about the factory he had visited, about the machines stamping out parts with mechanical precision, about the charts on the walls measuring efficiency, about the workers eating sandwiches and discussing ways to improve the process. There was no drama there, no speeches about blood and soil and destiny. Just people doing a job, doing it well, doing it at a scale that was quietly, terrifyingly unstoppable. Germany had tried to conquer Europe through force of will. America was conquering through force of production. One approach required constant inspiration and sacrifice. The other just required showing up to work and doing your job properly. He wrote, "The P-38 pilot who shot me down did not need to be a hero. He just needed to understand his weapon and use it correctly. He fired from 1,000 yards because that was the effective range of his guns. He did not close to 200 yards to prove his courage. Why would he? His goal was to kill me, not to impress me. We confused the two things. We thought fighting with honor meant fighting in a certain way. They understood that the only honor in war is winning it quickly and going home." Werner paused, thinking about his daughter back in Berlin. She was 7 years old. He had not seen her in more than a year. She was growing up in a country that was being bombed every night, where food was scarce, where her mother had to burn furniture to keep their apartment warm. All because Germany's leaders had believed their own propaganda, had thought that will and ideology could defeat mathematics and industry. The transformation in Werner's mind was complete by the end of that winter. He looked at America now and saw clearly what he had been taught not to see. This was not a weak nation of mongrels and degenerates. This was a functioning society built on pragmatism and abundance. These were not inferior people. They were just people, no better or worse than Germans, but operating within a system that worked. They tested ideas and kept what succeeded. They measured results instead of clinging to doctrine. They valued efficiency over tradition. When a smart young engineer proposed putting all the guns in the nose of a fighter, someone in authority had said, "Yes, let us try that. Let us see if it works." In Germany, that engineer would have been told he was violating proper design principles, that fighters had always had wing guns, that this was how things were done. Werner closed his notebook and looked around the barracks. 50 men sleeping in clean bunks with warm blankets. 50 men who had tried to kill Americans and were now being kept alive and healthy at American expense. 50 men who were learning the same lesson he had learned, though some would refuse to accept it even as the evidence surrounded them. Germany had lost this war long before the first shot was fired. They had lost it in the schools that taught ideology instead of science. They had lost it in the factories that could not match American production. They had lost it in the minds of leaders who believed what they wanted to believe instead of what the numbers clearly showed. The P-38, with its strange design and its impossible reach, was just a symbol of that deeper truth. America had been willing to look foolish in order to be effective. Germany had insisted on looking strong even as it grew weaker. Werner finally understood the difference, and understanding it felt like waking from a long, feverish dream into cold, clear daylight. Werner Hoffmann returned to Germany in the late summer of 1946, more than a year after the war had ended. The ship that carried him and 200 other former prisoners across the Atlantic was a converted troop transport, crowded and uncomfortable but clean. They were fed regularly. No one was beaten or starved. When the ship docked in Bremerhaven, Werner walked down the gangplank carrying everything he owned in a canvas bag the Americans had given him. Inside were 2 changes of clothes, a coat, his notebook filled with observations and thoughts, and 3 technical manuals about aircraft design that a sympathetic American officer had allowed him to keep. The officer had said that Germany would need to rebuild, and knowledge was the only currency that mattered now. The city of Bremerhaven was rubble. Buildings that Werner remembered from before the war when he had passed through on his way to officer training simply did not exist anymore. In their place were mountains of broken concrete and twisted metal. Some structures still stood, but they were hollow shells with empty windows and collapsed roofs. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and gray, dressed in whatever scraps they could find. Children with enormous eyes watched the former prisoners disembark, hoping for food or cigarettes or anything that could be traded. Werner saw a woman who might have been 30 or might have been 50, it was impossible to tell, sitting on a pile of bricks and crying silently into her hands. No one stopped to comfort her. Everyone had their own grief. Werner took a train south towards Munich, or tried to. The rail system barely functioned. Tracks had been bombed and repaired and bombed again. Bridges were gone. Stations were ruined. The journey that should have taken 1 day stretched into 5. The train stopped frequently for reasons no one explained. Sometimes they waited for hours while crews cleared debris from the tracks. Sometimes they simply sat in silence while the engine cooled or while officials argued about schedules that no longer meant anything. Werner shared a compartment with 6 other men, all former soldiers, all returning to whatever remained of their homes. They did not talk much. What was there to say? Through the train window, Werner watched Germany pass by. Every city was destroyed. Every town showed damage. Even the villages had scars. He saw factories that were now just empty frameworks of steel beams pointing at the sky like accusing fingers. He saw apartment buildings sheared in half, their interiors exposed like dollhouses, furniture still visible in rooms that no longer had walls. He saw bridges that ended halfway across rivers, their far sections lying in the water below. This was the result of American precision bombing, of the B-17s and B-24s that had come by the hundreds, by the thousands, protected by fighters that included the P-38 with its long-range capability and its nose-mounted guns. The Americans had built an air force that could reach anywhere, hit anything, and return home safely. Germany had built an air force designed for quick, decisive victories in short campaigns. When the war stretched into years, when it became about endurance and production, the outcome had been inevitable. Munich was worse than Bremerhaven. The beautiful city of Werner's youth was a landscape of destruction. The apartment building where he had lived with his wife and daughter still stood, remarkably, though the building next to it was gone and the one beyond that had only 3 walls remaining. Werner climbed the stairs, noticing how the stairwell smelled of damp and mold and things rotting. He reached the 3rd floor and knocked on the door of what had been his home. A long silence. Then footsteps. Then his wife's voice, suspicious and afraid, asking who was there. He said his name. The door opened. His wife stood there, and Werner barely recognized her. She had been beautiful once, soft and laughing, with color in her cheeks and light in her eyes. Now she was gaunt, her hair thin and dull, her face lined with hardship. She stared at him for a moment as if he might be a ghost, then made a sound that was half laugh and half sob and pulled him inside. Their daughter appeared from the other room, and Werner's heart broke. She was 9 years old now, tall and thin, wearing a dress that had been patched many times and was still too small for her. She looked at him uncertainly. She had been 6 when he left for the war. She barely remembered him. That night, after his daughter had gone to sleep on the mattress they all shared because it was the only way to stay warm, Werner and his wife sat at the small table in their kitchen and talked. She told him everything. The bombing raids that came at night, the sirens, the shelters, the sound of the city being torn apart, the hunger that had started as an inconvenience and became the central fact of existence, the winter when they had burned their furniture to survive, the day the American tanks had arrived and everyone had expected to be killed, but instead the Americans had set up food distribution centers. She told him about standing in line for bread from the occupiers, about the shame of it, about how the bread was soft and white and better than anything they had eaten in years. Werner listened and said little. What could he say? He had been in America, in a prison camp, eating 3 meals a day. He had gained weight during his captivity while his family starved. The guilt of that sat in his chest like a stone. But there was something else, too, something he needed to tell her, though he was not sure how to begin. Finally, he got up and took his notebook from his bag. He showed her what he had written, his observations about American industry, about their approach to problem solving, about the P-38 and what it represented. His wife read slowly, by the light of a single candle, because electricity was still rationed. When she finished, she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. She said the Nazis had told them America was weak. She said the propaganda had shown images of American poverty, of breadlines during the Depression, of racial conflict and crime. She said they had been assured that Germany's industrial might and warrior spirit would crush the Americans easily. Werner nodded. He had believed the same things. They had all believed. That was the power of propaganda, of hearing the same lies repeated until they sounded like truth. His wife was quiet for a moment, then said that when the American soldiers had arrived in Munich, she had expected monsters. She had hidden their daughter in a cellar. But the Americans had been polite, almost gentle. They gave chocolate to children. They helped clear rubble. They brought in food and medicine. They were just young men, far from home, who seemed as tired of war as everyone else. Over the following months, Werner tried to find work. Germany was being rebuilt under Allied supervision, and there was a desperate need for people with technical skills. He eventually found a position with a company that was reforming to build civilian aircraft, though under strict limitations imposed by the occupying powers. No military production was allowed. Everything had to be inspected and approved. It was humiliating for many of the older engineers who had designed the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But Werner found himself relieved. He had no desire to build weapons anymore. He worked alongside men who had been his colleagues before the war, and slowly they began to talk about what had happened, about what they had learned. One of them, a senior designer named Otto, had been captured by the British and held in England. He told stories similar to Werner's about the industrial capacity he had witnessed, about the casual abundance that seemed impossible to German eyes. Another man, younger, had been in the East and captured by the Soviets. His experience had been different, brutal and harsh, but even he admitted that Soviet production capacity had been staggering, with factories churning out tanks at rates that Germany could never match. Werner shared his observations about the P-38, about the philosophy behind its design. He showed them his technical manuals. Together, they began to understand what had been wrong with German engineering culture. It had been too rigid, too bound to tradition, too influenced by ideology. When a design violated the accepted way of doing things, it was rejected not because it did not work, but because it seemed wrong. The Americans and British had been more flexible. They tested ideas. They kept what worked and discarded what did not. They did not care if something looked strange or violated tradition. They cared about results. Werner began writing a longer document, expanding on his notebook observations. He wrote about the lessons Germany needed to learn. He wrote about the importance of measuring and testing instead of assuming. He wrote about the danger of believing your own propaganda. He wrote about how the P-38 Centerline guns had been effective precisely because they ignored conventional wisdom. The document circulated among engineers and slowly made its way to the attention of the new German aviation authorities. Some dismissed it as the bitter reflections of a defeated man. Others recognized its value. Years passed. Werner's daughter grew up in the new Germany that was emerging from the ruins. She went to school, learned English, studied mathematics and science. One evening when she was 15, she asked her father about the war. She had been learning about it in school, about the Holocaust and the invasion of Poland and the millions dead. She wanted to know what he had been fighting for, whether he had believed in the Nazi cause. Werner sat with her and told her the truth. He said he had believed, or at least he had not questioned. He said he had been proud to serve, proud to be a fighter pilot, convinced that Germany was in the right. He told her about being shot down by a plane he never saw, about the prison camp in Pennsylvania, about the Christmas dinner that had broken something inside him. His daughter listened carefully, then asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. She asked if he had fought bravely. Werner thought about his answer for a long time. Finally, he said that bravery did not matter when you were fighting for a lie. He said he had flown his missions with skill and courage, but that skill and courage in service of an evil cause were worse than useless. They were harmful. He said the P-38 pilot who shot him down had not needed to be brave. He had just needed to be competent, to understand his weapon, to use it correctly. The pilot had fired from 1,000 yards because that was the effective range. He had not closed to 200 yards to prove anything. His goal was to win and go home. The Germans had confused victory with honor and had thought that fighting in a certain way mattered more than achieving results. Werner told his daughter that Germany had lost the war in its schools and its factories and its philosophy long before the first battle. He said they had been taught to value will over measurement, ideology over evidence, tradition over innovation. He said the distance between the P-38's guns and Messerschmitt's guns, that 600 or 800 yards of empty air, represented the distance between two different ways of thinking about the world. The Americans had already won the future, while Germany was still fighting the past. His daughter asked what that meant for her generation, for the new Germany being built. Werner said it meant they had to learn to question, to test, to accept evidence even when it contradicted what they wanted to believe. It meant they had to value truth over comfort. In his later years, Werner became a teacher at a technical university. He taught aircraft design, but more importantly, he taught a way of thinking. He kept his old notebook, yellow and fragile now, and sometimes he would read from it to his students. He would tell them about the P-38, about how it had looked wrong and been right. He would tell them about the prison camp, about the abundance that had seemed impossible. He would tell them that the most dangerous thing an engineer could do was fall in love with his own ideas, refuse to test them, and ignore evidence that contradicted them. Some students understood immediately, others took years. A few never learned, and Werner recognized in them the same rigid thinking that had doomed his generation. Werner died in 1982, an old man in a rebuilt Germany that was prosperous and democratic and at peace. His daughter, who would become an engineer herself, found his notebook among his possessions. She read it again, decades after he had first shown it to her, and she finally understood everything he had been trying to teach. The P-38 had been just an airplane, but what it represented was eternal. It represented the victory of pragmatism over ideology, of measurement over assumption, of humble testing over arrogant certainty. It represented the truth that looking foolish while being effective was better than looking strong while being wrong. She kept the notebook, and years later she donated it to a museum, where it sits now in a glass case, its pages open to a single line that her father had underlined twice. They had already won the future, and we were still fighting the past. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.